This is Michael Reed Trice, Director of the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University. And today, through our podcast at the Religica Theolab, we're speaking about a scholars symposium that's been meeting for this past year through the center. The topic of that symposium is gratitude, injury, and repair in a pandemic age. And papers are being drafted now by the 13 scholars who are participating in the study. Two of those scholars are joining me today. The first is Dr. Douglas Paduty. Dr. Paduty completed his PhD in philosophy. His doctoral thesis, Sprache als Bewegen, The Unfolding of Language and Being in Heidegger's later works, focused on Martin Heidegger's understanding of language, that more than a tool is meant to communicate language that informs and transforms us. Dr. Peduti also entered the Jesuits in 1983 and was ordained as a Jesuit priest in 1996. Our second scholar is Dr. Edward Donaldson, who serves as the director of the Doctor of Ministry program at the School of Theology and Ministry at Seattle University, where he serves on the core faculty, teaches in multiple degree programs, and has published 7 unique books. Dr. Donaldson is a bishop in the church. He's also a professor and author, a thought coach, and works often in multimedia contexts. Now, I mentioned that the scholars group of 12 to 13 scholars have been meeting over this past year on this theme of gratitude, injury, and repair in a pandemic age. And today, we're going to spend more time discussing what do we mean by a pandemic age? What does it include? How is it impacting our families and our communities? And more. I invite you to take a listen. As the scholars have met, you all have spoken earnestly with one another about what a pandemic age is and is becoming, because we're not through this yet. As you've discussed that with one another, and what are you learning from one another about that age as you're in conversation as scholars together?
When I think of our current situation with the pandemic age, it seems as though there's a lot of resistance to either admitting that this is a pandemic age or the actual dynamics of it is different than what others would say. I know that there's a political issue there as well, but I think there's this issue of, I think we believe as a society that we're beyond such things as pandemics, that in our modern technological age, we've conquered those types of things, and we are very resistant to believe that we are vulnerable. So I think there's a resistance there on that. So that's just a pre-note. But the second thing I'd like to say about this current pandemic age is what seems to be a kind of a confusion around it of how to treat it, whether we should have it treated, what are the various solutions to it. It has become so muddled. Reading and teaching Camus' The Plague, I'm realizing that no, our age is not all that particularly special, that this seems to be the dynamic of all pandemic ages, where we're afraid of it and therefore we like to deny it. And if we can't deny it, well, then we try to bargain or we just fall to depression in it. I think there's some stages of grief going on here.
Doug, I completely agree with you. There seems to be a fragility in our psyche around self-awareness. And just this idea of being aware of our own finitude seems to unmoor us. And I think not having lived through any previous pandemic age, but having studied other pandemic ages, it seems to be more of a crisis now because we have gotten so far away from our own fragility and our own interiority, because we have become so digitized and life has become sanitized and almost anesthetized, that dealing with the realities of human limitations seems to have an impact on the mentality of the masses in ways that other pandemic ages did not. And the closer you get to power and privilege, the more fragile the idea of mortality and finitude becomes. And so for folks on the margins and folks on the edges who live a threatening life, closest to morbidity, it seems to be less traumatic. But as you get into circles of power and privilege, there's a visceral response to this pandemic age because it causes them to confront that which maybe they feel better than.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at this time, we also have a lot of concern, as we know, in our communities about environmental degradation, marginalization of whole communities, this viral pandemic in and of itself. And in the midst of it, a kind of a recognition that the normative structures for how we've guided life, and I say we there in quotes, because even that needs to be really interrogated. You know, who are those structures serving best and also serving the least? That a lot has been exposed over this last 2 years. Is that part of a pandemic age? That kind of a recognition that perhaps how life seemed to be welded together structurally, a viral pandemic has a way of casting a very strong light and asking us to interrogate much more than, say, physical well-being. What do you think of that, either of you?
I think so, Michael. And I think there's a vulnerability that happens, a mass vulnerability that happens in the confrontation of a virus that can't be seen. There's one thing to have a threat that's visible and traceable and knowable, but there's something insidious about a threat that is invisible, transmitted through the very act of being, right? Because without breathing, there's no being. And so this is an attack on being that makes folks particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, I was thinking that this is one of those strange events where real life follows fiction. For generations, we've been watching all these apocalyptic types of movies and series, and there's always this antagonist that refuses to accept. And it's the line is always from the comical Men in Black 2, I think it is, where it says, humans are individually very bright, but collectively we're very stupid. We tend to always overreact and refuse to see what's in front of us until it's too late. I like to believe that the last part, the till it's too late, is not part of our fact. I'm hoping that in this issue, climate change, the summit, I think the alarm bells are ringing. I hope that our leaders can respond, but more importantly, I hope that they can convince us as corporations and public and private entities that we can actually get down to the nitty-gritty and really deal with it. On climate. But there's also, as you've mentioned, Edward, so much more. The issues of inequalities been exposed, and it makes those who are in power very uncomfortable because they're responsible. And if they're responsible, that means either they have to deal with it or they will be thrown out of power. And that urge to stay into power, I think, is very strong.
You both mentioned earlier reference to grief and fragility and maybe brittleness, and reference to Camus' The Plague. I think I think near the end of that, the town is actually turned inward. There's this sense in which grief has us burying our heads in the sand or turning us inward. Fragility can certainly feel that way, but maybe none of us thought, particularly in the United States, that we would have over 650,000, nearing 700,000 deaths, that somehow death would visit the doorways indiscriminately of anyone who happened to contract this virus. Now, what I mean by that is there are certainly those in society who are in safer places by virtue of they may not be a first responder, or they have the privilege of being able to, say, work at home and don't have as much exposure to a virus. But this virus, once one has it, has a tendency to make one very ill and even to cause death. And maybe we had, as I believe, Doug, you had mentioned earlier, somehow thought we were impermeable to that something about our modern or postmodern lives makes us believe we're not susceptible in that same way. I think there are plenty of communities in the United States alone who would say, no, we never believed that. There's some communities who may feel that they're impermeable, but other communities have been vulnerable long before this pandemic arrived. So grief shows up differently, right? It's not all the same kind of grief for all these communities. And yet that doesn't stop a kind of larger lack of conversation. I mean, there's so little conversation really in this country about what the pandemic is and what it's doing to us. Does that surprise you, or what do you think?
I think there's a larger narrative at play in the American psyche. Let's step away from individual communities and let's look at the civic religion of America that has always seen our nation as a city on a hill. And somehow there's kind of a chosen people narrative that runs through the history and the fabric of our existence as a nation. And I think we have thought ourselves a bit of Goshen in that we thought we had the blood of the lamb sprinkled on the doorposts of the borders of the United States. And we thought plague would not come unto us. Although we have our own troubles and histories with plagues and viruses, but I do think every time it comes as kind of this awakening out of the malaise of the lies, of the myths of the founding of our nation. And our marginalized communities serve to kind of be the counter narrative, to expose the lies, to debunk the myth that we are somehow the chosen people, and that the global community is one community. It's one global village. And we are a very, very new enterprise and experiment in that global village. But I think the shock and awe is deeper than our postmodernism. I think it goes all the way back to the very myths that found our nation, this idea that it is the will of God, the desire of God for America to be great. And it's particularly stunning for us in an era of Make America Great Again, right? Because we entered into the pandemic on the heels of a resurgence of this mythology around the greatness of our nation. And I think that has probably startled the masses in ways that we'll be studying for another 100 years or so.
Yeah, I agree with you, Edward. There is still this very strong desire for us as those in the United States, for us to say that we're still part of this great generation. This is our century. That all came out of, the outcome of World War II. And we had somewhat of this savior complex. And I think we're still living in that we believe that through our technology, our wealth, our supposed good nature, generosity, that we are the leaders, and that we can be invulnerable because of that. And I agree, it is members of our community that are always affected the greatest, or I should say worse, that's a tonal change there for me, that they help us to open our eyes. This is not the American century at all. And if anything, we can learn from that we need to be more humble in our place in the world, but more importantly, we need to be aware of our own faults vis-a-vis the world.
With the scholars and the group of which the two of you are a part, you spent some considerable time talking about the nature of injury, not just, say, viral injury or physical injury due to a virus on the body, but also other forms of injury that I think both of you are referencing now: moral injury, societal injury, let's say, communal harm as a feature of our time, or even how this pandemic is revealing transgenerational harm or injury. One that came up last week was interesting for me as well was fatigue, even empathy fatigue as a form of injury. And I think the listener might have a sense of that. This has been a long haul for a lot of people, both in terms of their kind of emotional and psychosocial stability, the impact on their families, on jobs, on their general well-being. When you're taking on this issue of injury for both of you, what are you focusing on most that would be important for the listener to hear now?
That's a great question, Michael. I recall when the pandemic first started, and every night there were these a great applauding of our first responders, and with pots and pans, whether it was Italy or the United States or just being in the backyard in Seattle of Swedish hospital. And there was this sense of we're in this and we're going to really support our doctors and nurses. And now what are we hearing? The hospitals are losing nurses and doctors manyfold. The idea is they're exhausted. They can't deal with, I think it's the emotional exhaustion, the fatigue. They're accustomed to dealing with pain and injury, bodily injury, and they know how to treat it. What they are not prepared for is this emotional resistance, even to those who are so seriously ill that they're about to die and they still refuse to believe that there was COVID-19 that they had. This is, I find this, I'm going to say fascinating, but that's certainly the wrong word. The psyche is really far richer and deeper than we've ever imagined. We believe that we can logically think through this, but there are so many dimensions of ourselves that we really don't understand it. Trauma is really, and I think we're in trauma. I think that it is one where we cannot really express what's going on. That's the definition of trauma, that our body reacts, our emotions react in ways that we are not in control. And I think that is injury, really, in an existential way. But it also, that injury, I think, is also, we need to look at that injury because I think it's going to teach us something about ourselves. The idea that as humans, we're not in total control. And we need to learn how to adapt in that regard.
My own situatedness and I guess the realities of my own location always lead me to think about injury, maybe even at a genetic level. As I listen to you, Michael, talking about generational and transgenerational injury, I can't help but think of Henrietta Lacks. I can't help but think of the Tuskegee experiment. I can't help but say the reason that many marginalized communities are having difficulty embracing vaccination, trusting the information on COVID, are because there is some societal harm that goes back generations, right? A mistrust of the medical field because of experiment, because of the harm that's been done in these communities by the medical community. And this isn't to cast any kind of dispersion on the medical community or to be anti-scientific, but it is to say that there are whole groups of people whose experiences with doctors, medical schools were still teaching as of the early 2000s that Black people don't experience pain at the same levels as white people. And so you have doctors, young doctors coming out when people are saying that they're having pain in the hospital, they're hesitant to give them any kind of narcotic because they believe Black people to be more prone to addiction and to experience pain at lower volume. So folks are actually being tortured in our medical institutions, lying in pain because of systemic racism. So when it comes to where we are and the impact and effect of fatigue as it relates to COVID-19, that fatigue is generational fatigue for some communities. It's not just the 2 years of isolation. It's not just being in our homes and unable to engage with our families. It's not just a fatigue of generosity and graciousness. It's a fatigue of dealing with systems that for generations have damaged and wounded people disproportionately in our communities. So some of our communities are experiencing a much deeper sense of fatigue, an existential fatigue, but also an experiential fatigue.
I wonder, this discussion on the impact of trauma, both on a current generation and on the unfolding generations. It's interesting how scriptures across different religions will have references to, what we might call, say, this will be visited on the 7th generation or on multiple generations after, this sense in which trauma has kind of echo or a reverb on the generation after that. And there's a professor that was connected to the Human Genome Project, has now been working on brain science, and she works a lot on epigenetic kind of features of, she's from Howard University, she's a genomicist herself, and her recent study on the impact of trauma, and I think, Doug, you're also quite right in terms of the what's not known about the trauma that we're encountering, and then Edward, in terms of the trauma that has this transgenerational impact. Do we have any confidence now about how the trauma of this pandemic and its viral impact, as well as other kinds of injuries that are taking place? We know that genomicists will reflect upon the arrival of autoimmune disorders, Crohn's disease, colitis, other kinds of things, including asthma, heart disease, kidney disease, elevated rates of this for populations that have experienced significant trauma. We might say already some of this is in the whole discussion about, say, long haulers around this particular virus. That's a phrase we see often. But we really haven't reserved that conversation either, have we? That we may be 20, 30, 40 years or more needing to have a conversation in society about what the trauma of this virus has visited upon, not just this generation, but the next generation. Have you given any thought to that? Or do you have any thoughts on the kind of ontology of injury, or how injury has that kind of reverb effect that families and communities need to be really mindful of, and not, Edward, as I think as you were just suggesting, I believe, not think of this pandemic as having a clear beginning, middle, and end, as though we drop off into some new normativity. But no, there's more to this narrative that's going to endure with us for some time. What are any reflections the two of you have on this and trauma?
Certainly, I would agree with your suggestion here in the question, but also with what Edward was saying earlier. We don't know what the effects will be, where we're already looking forward to the end, that this is going to be manageable. And I perhaps the physiological response to the actual virus we might have a handle on that. But I don't think in an existential way, whether psychologically or communally, socially, we will have a handle on that. I think it's very clear that there is no going back to whatever it is that some people hope to go back to. And that very well may be a good thing. If we can see this as not just a physical individual injury that needs some sort of healing process, we as a community need a healing process. And I think that we can look at this as a threshold where we're about to step out, perhaps, into the unknown. And we can make very distinct decisions and moves in ways that could really heal us as a community or continue to entrench those past problematic behaviors.
I'm mindful that there are societies for which the opening greeting is "How are the children?" Because I think there's a school of thought that says that a culture, a society, a community is only as healthy as its children. So my mind goes, I have a 16-year-old daughter. I know, Michael, that you have a child around the same age. And I think about the trajectory of her high school career. And what high school has meant for her is very, very different for what high school meant for myself and for yourself and all of us. We didn't have, full school years where we didn't have engagement with our classmates. And yet there are folks that have been born in COVID who for the first year and a half of their life didn't have human interaction outside of their families at home, their family units. So they weren't meeting new people in the way that babies get out and meet new people. And they learned eye contact on screens. These are the types of injuries that we won't be able to study for 30 years, 35 years. What will that mean what will it mean to be a senior citizen who was born in COVID? We're just not going to know. There's so many unknowns. And the impact and effects of this particular pandemic age will have tentacles that we can't yet even imagine. We just haven't had the time to think about what all will be impacted, what will have to be navigated, how society will shift and morph and change. What does it mean for elementary students, junior high students to have never gone to a public library? Not because the public library system has collapsed, but because it's been inaccessible to them. And all of their education has come through online access. And I know we were moving away from visiting public libraries anyway, because you can get so much information on the internet. But there's an experience that we've kind of had a communal tradition of taking young people to library. I mean, all of these types of things will have to be studied and they'll unfold for us in years to come.
Yeah, Martha Nussbaum is dealing with this in an interesting way. Our society tends to be Aristotelian, where it sets up what it sees to be the excellent virtues and what it deems to be perfect, and then encourages us all to move towards that goal. So she is an Aristotelian, but she says it's wrong-headed to devise a community around the strongest. The community needs to find out what might be the neediest person and focus on how to help that person attain happiness. And the rest of us can go along with that, absolutely. She says that future generations will pass judgment on ours on the way that we deal with our elderly. And as we know, with the nursing home situation and the number of deaths, the percentage of deaths there, it was just horrendous. And it is true, as Edward's saying, generations, our progeny will somehow live with this, and sometimes in aware of why they're struggling in this way or that way, socially or politically, or with regards to science, or in all sorts of ways. But most of this will be unconscious. This is how we live, and this is just the way it is. And I'm not sure that this is what the person might be saying. And Charles Taylor talks about this, the malaise of the age, that we don't know how to define it. We keep telling ourselves that we should be happy or we should be able to do this, but there's turmoil. Our mind and our hearts and our bodies seem to be at odds, and we're paralyzed at what to do. I think our next generation will be very much steeped in this malaise.
This malaise and maybe this sense of ambivalence about which direction to move in, given that, let me just give you an example. I'd like to get both of your comments on this. We've seen repeatedly in the news around, the injury that is felt particularly in U.S. society. I think this is something that is congruent with the larger myth around freedom in the United States. It's somehow I, as a desperado or as an individual untangled from other individuals, could talk about my own personal liberty, my own freedom as somehow sacred, even sanctioned by a God, let's say, or by the divine, and that any kind of impingement on that in the form of the jab or a vaccine, let's say, is a fundamental distress and trespass on that very freedom that I have embodied so fully. It's almost as though we're all little automatons with our own little individual balkanized freedoms. But the reality, of course, across the grain of that mythos is that it's the e pluribus unum, at least in a political sense, and that my freedom or my personal liberty is wrapped up and certainly tangled in the liberty and freedoms of others. So if I don't get vaccinated, then I am, in fact, jeopardizing not only my own health, but I'm jeopardizing the health of others whose liberty is also dependent on mine and vice versa. Like somehow there's a moral skip in the needle. And part of the injury, perhaps, that we're experiencing is we don't recognize our collective sinewed well-being. I mean, it's just stunning sometimes. And maybe, on the other hand, I shouldn't be so stunned. Maybe what's being exposed is what's always been there. We're pretty self-consumed as Americans about our own freedom, and it has a way of undermining our ability to overcome, serious stressors, such as a viral pandemic. That's injurious. What do the two of you think of that?
Well, Michael, for me, I have to say I'm not surprised by this kind of privatization of rights. For me, in my paper, I talk a bit about this Leviathan, this many-headed dragon that we are facing. Anti-Black, imperialist, capitalist, cis-heteropatriarchy causes us to lose the reality that I am human and nothing human is foreign to me because I am everything that it means to be human. But when I live in a culture and a society that isolates parts of my being and subordinates other parts of my being in the human family, of course I'm going to privatize rights. And of course it's going to be more important to me to have the right not to be vaccinated than it is for me to care for my siblings. Because after all, there's some part of my identity that makes my sibling a non-being and makes me a special being. And so I'm not at all shocked by this kind of divisive personalization in the midst of pandemic, because we've been socialized to believe that we are above and that we are better than, and that we have no responsibility to the whole or to the collective unless that whole or collective is reflective of my own self. So the whole culture is set up for a self-centeredness that works against us when the falsity of this privatization becomes really, really clear based on a global pandemic, right? Because the pandemic leaps social class, it leaps racial identification. Any caste system that's set up is broken by a viral pandemic caused by breathing. And so, yeah, I guess I'm not at all surprised by it, I think it is actually the reward or the consequence of the way we've ordered and structured our society.
That's interesting, Edward. When you mentioned the Leviathan, I was thinking about how the Leviathan for Hobbes was this large entity that was so frightening that we would stop being at war with one another because we were afraid of it. And this is a time when we really started talking civilly about what does freedom mean. And oftentimes the ethicist at this point in time would say, do no harm. Otherwise, I am completely free to do what I want as long as I do no harm to others. I don't think these Enlightenment theories hold any longer. They are based on a number of assumptions, but more importantly, and as you say, there's consequences there, that once that Leviathan becomes universally hated, well, then this whole idea of civil society built on this notion falls apart. And I see this happening where we need a new way to reorganize our thoughts. But this is not a thinking project. I think you're really on the right track, Edward. We really need to look at those in our community who are affected the most, that have the least, that are considered to be non-being, like the Dalits in India. We need to look at them, and we need to really listen to them on how they live and how society and how we can actually see one another. This idea that freedom, no matter what, we're seeing it all the time now, that this is an issue of freedom. We're the land of the free. Well, what happened to the idea of do no harm?
Yeah, and I'm hoping, Doug, to your analysis, I'm hoping that by pointing out the Leviathan, we can come to the place where the Leviathan is hated. But it seems like there are powers within our society, within our culture, that the more you point out the Leviathan, have organized themselves around the idea of protecting the Leviathan instead of seeing the monster as so dangerous for us all. There are groups of folks that the monster has become domesticated. It's now a pet. And I hope that the project of the masses is to expose the error of domesticating a Leviathan that can destroy us all.
I mean, the idea of, even for teenagers, always trying to ingratiate themselves to the bully so that the bully finds someone else to bully. There is a way that we tend to find that, well, this Leviathan, well, it's not all that bad. This ingratiation is really a self-protective defensive mechanism.
Yeah, my New Thought friends have a concept that the all is one. So their idea of the transcendent third is the all, and that the back of all things is one. I think there's something to be harvested from that faith tradition because the sooner we recognize the interconnectedness of our human condition, which I think this virus points to, the sooner we'll be able to make claim for what is healthy for us in rethinking and reordering and restructuring a society, whether that's the caste system of India or the American caste system that we have set up that we refuse to name.
Okay.
In the last 4 decades, we've spent a lot of time in scholarship and in faith communities honoring the story of that particular community, wherever it may be. It might be a small rural community somewhere in the country or around the globe, or it could be an urban context in which a number of communities are living. But we know that where we've really listened to those specific particular stories with truth claims and kind of values inside of those, that we've benefited greatly, right, by hearing what those narratives or stories are telling us about the community's own self-expression. When those communities are healed, or pardon me, are injured, as happens in a pandemic like this, it sweeps across us. It doesn't care much for individualized narratives. People get maimed and hurt and die. Repair, in a time when we have placed so much emphasis on the particular story, at the same time, repair isn't just diminished to the particular, right? We require, as I'm listing the two of you, a kind of deeper sinewed societal repair that addresses this pandemic age. What are the two of you thinking about in your papers, and what are you learning from one another in the conversation with other colleagues about repair, about what's necessary, about what's possible today? What do you think?
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer. I think at one point, probably about 20 years ago, it occurred to me that, this idea of success was paramount in my life. And it never seemed to really feel right. And I remember talking to a very trusted and wise, perhaps even wizened fellow. And he said, well, this idea of individualism is a false notion. From the very moment that we come into the world, we come in as a community, a family. We cannot survive on our own. We never could. And any ways that we succeed are really intertwined with others who assist us, who are there behind us, et cetera, et cetera. I guess what I'm working at is this idea of how do we really convince ourselves as a society, and I think America is what I think really needs work on this, is how do we convince ourselves that our community, our belongingness to a community, is a priority greater than being an individual with individual rights and freedoms. Yes, individual rights and freedom are good, but it should be secondary to the community. How do we convince others that this idea that the community is a value par excellence?
I think Dr. Cornel West often talks about we are always born, and each individual is born somewhere between urine and feces in the dark canal of love, right? That love brings us into being. I think we're becoming more and more aware of just how close a proximity we are to urine and feces. And I think in order for us to move into a new way of being, reimagining what it means to be a whole people, the particularities really matter. And when we arrive at what these individual needs are, we really do arrive at the collective needs. Because your particularity is a part of the universal, and addressing that particularity is very different than being individualized, isn't it? Right? It is our collective responsibility to the individual that causes us to tend to your particularities, and in tending to said particularities, we tend to the universals, we tend to the whole. I think the more I sit in community thinking through this project that we've been doing, what I take away is I take away my inability to see the whole. I can't see it because until I get proximate to the other, I don't have a clue of what is on the other side. The gift of this work together is the gift of proximity. that I come alongside your particularity. And when I pay attention to it, it causes me to have a better picture of the whole. Now I know how to be a better global citizen. I know how to show up in my full humanity because I've been alongside of other humans with particularities I don't possess and cannot often see. I become aware of my blind spots, my own prejudices, my own presuppositions, that my own way of being is not the entire landscape, and that's kind of what I take away from this is the need for connectedness in a time where we're so disconnected in many ways, the hunger for, the need for, and the gift of connectedness.
Is it the case in the last few minutes that we have? But listening to the two of you as you have just landed on kind of interconnectivity and how we stay in community and the gratitude we have as the listener will attest, in our families, for one another, for our communities, for those connections that are deeply rooted and have sustained us in many ways through this time in the last 2 years. Could you say a word about what each of you is thinking about in terms of gratitude and this project you've worked on?
I've mentioned a few times that I have a complex relationship with gratitude where perhaps it was my mother, but I don't want to blame her, that anything that anyone would give me or do something, she'd say, "What do you say?" Right. And I say, "Well, thank you," almost begrudgingly, that I had to do this to get to the next step. Well, I suspect that we're all on this journey of learning real gratitude as opposed to the superficial gratitude. And so when I think of gratitude now, it really is this idea that I can't do this on my own. I can't figure out life, and I'll never be happy on my own. And the very fact that I am in that way of being poor, that I need others, that it starts to show me that, yes, I am grateful for others, that they aren't impositions of my time or treasure, but they are there as valuable in of themselves, but as also how they are interconnected to me. It's not so much of thank you so I can move on. Gratitude now is an openness to others that really shows me what is important in life.
Yeah, Doug, I guess I'll just piggyback on that as I think forced gratitude is the theater of cruelty, isn't it? Because authentic gratitude is the foundation of personhood, that when one claims for oneself what one is grateful for, one steps into the freedom of self-identification.
Yeah.
The longer I work on this project, the longer I think of gratitude as a radical act of resistance, the more I double down on the idea that gratitude for marginalized people is a reclamation of personhood and an invitation out of the zone of non-being. That the only way to be fully present and functional as a human being is to name that for which I am grateful.
Yeah.
And while I understand the temptation to live in anger and rage because of marginalization and denial of personhood, denial of access to power and privilege, there's something even more powerful about naming my gratitude than naming my rage. Rage is a foreseeable and foregone conclusion of marginalization. Gratitude is the conquering of, it's the move beyond a foregone conclusion. Obviously, one denied will be enraged. But what is it that one denied will be grateful? That leads me to my highest self, my highest way of being in the world. And I think that's really what I take away from this.
If you'd like to learn more about the project Gratitude, Injury, and Repair in a Pandemic Age, you can visit us at www.seattleu.edu/the center. Thanks, gentlemen.